Good evening, and welcome to Making Michigan, the Bentley Historical Library series on the history of the University of Michigan. I'm Andrew Rutledge, the Bentley's in-house historian, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all tonight, either in person or virtually, to the historic Judy and Stanley Frankel Detroit Observatory, a division of the Bentley. I'd like to extend a special welcome to all of the U of M alumni who have joined us this evening, and I'd like to thank the Alumni Association of the University of Michigan's Lifelong Learning Program for co-sponsoring tonight's event. Thank you very much. This evening, we have a very exciting and I think really timely talk. For just under 3 weeks ago, we celebrated the University of Michigan's 181st spring commencement, and with it, the departure of thousands of new graduates from the campus. Simultaneously, the start of the warmer weather means we're witnessing the onset of Michigan's infamous construction season, as you may have discovered coming tonight. That combination of the suddenly quieter diag, along with the appearance seemingly overnight of hundreds, if not thousands, of orange barrels everywhere, always leaves me with the sense that whatever and whenever Michigan's newest alumni return to Ann Arbor, it will be to a very different school than the one they graduated from. But such changes are a natural part of the evolution of the University of Michigan or any college's history. Ever since classes started at U of M's original 40 acres here in Ann Arbor in 1841, every generation of students and every generation of faculty have cherished certain places on campus. Many were gathering places, such as the muddy cat hole that once stood as a muddy little pond about 100 yards that way from where we are tonight, or Ferry Field, where the Wolverines played football before the big house was ever even conceived. Most of these locations are now gone, but they're certainly not forgotten. Their existence and their treasured remembrances reflect not only their value in and of themselves, but also help us understand the broader patterns in the history of the university. And there is no one better suited to tell their story and the campus's story than our speaker tonight, Jim Tobin. Jim is a professor of media, journalism, and film at Miami University, Ohio, but not just because he works there doesn't mean he has a long history with the University of Michigan. Not only did he earn his PhD in history here at U of M, but he's also written extensively about U of M's history, from Michigan Today, the U of M Heritage Project, and many, many other publications. A collection of his writings have actually been assembled in a really great book I can't recommend highly enough, Sing to the Colors. A writer explores 2 centuries at the University of Michigan. I didn't bring my copy, and I'm very sorry about that, because otherwise I'd be waving it around and singing its praises. But he's also written a number of other books, including Ernie Pyle's War, America's Eyewitness to World War II, about the famous reporter, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award in Biography. So, love that. He's just a really, really wonderful storyteller who's going to give a great talk. I think you'll all enjoy it. Please join me in welcoming Jim Tobin.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Thanks a lot for making your way over here. I wasn't sure that I was ever going to get here, starting from the west side of town, and that was about 1:30 this afternoon, and I was a little late, but managed to make it. So Andrew kindly got in touch last fall and said, hey, could you maybe give a talk in our series in the spring, which seemed impossibly far off. So of course I said, sure, that sounds easy. Then when I got thinking about the topic, we had agreed that I would do something called The Lost Campus, picking up on a story that I've written in a couple of different ways over the years. I got thinking, and the talk about the Lost Campus sort of morphed into a different talk. And so now see, that's not working in. Let me just try this. This clicker is supposed to, there we go. So we might call it The Lost Campus, or The World the Students Made and Lost. That'll be one of the themes that I get through here tonight. I hope what I've sort of landed on will be interesting to everybody, at least with a few of these slides. I have some things to say about how the campus has changed, how it grew, and then how it changed. And I hope that mostly that will stimulate some questions on your mind and we'll have a good chance to have an exchange about that. So, with that, let's see if this clicker still works. An interesting thing that I've realized over time is just how planless the campus has been. From the very beginning, it has been an improvised campus. So I want to make a few points about this. There was indeed a master plan way back at the very beginning. The first Board of Regents coming on board in the late 1830s, just after Michigan became a state and the university was established, reestablished in Ann Arbor, hired a well-known young architect from out east, Alexander Jackson Davis, who came out, spent a few days, and devised a magnificent master plan for the campus. And this was the sort of very impressive first document that he handed over. Imagine State Street running along here, a magnificent sort of main building here, avenues stretching north and south, and then east and west, professors' homes up at that end. These are the buildings that he had in mind. The main building was to be this enormous library/chapel. You can see how big it is by the human figure down here. That was the front view facing State. This is the side view. Everybody looked at this and said, my gosh, what an amazing edifice this would be. What an amazing plan for the campus. And they handed it over to John D. Pierce, who was the superintendent of education for the new state of Michigan. And he said it would absorb so much of the university fund as would cripple it in all time to come. He did think it was a wonderful plan for these buildings. So this really sets up a tension that characterized the history of the university ever since, which is the university proposes, Lansing disposes. There has never been enough support from the legislature to carry out any sort of master plan for the university. It was true in the 1830s, continued on through the 19th century. Even North Campus, which was supposed to be a big, well-planned development with the great architect Eliel Saarinen in charge, could never really get the funds together to build Saarinen's plan, and he finally dropped out after a few years. So North Campus, too, became a matter of piecemeal building, improvisation. So it began here. You all have seen this famous photograph probably. These were the first two buildings. Mason Hall, named for Stephen C. Mason, the boy governor of Michigan, was also a member of the Board of Regents. That was the first, and then an identical building that became called South Hall down there. These very drab, plain constructions. I'm going to say something about the architectural style of the early buildings. I don't know what anybody would say about the architectural style of these buildings except that they were cheap. And the local builders tossed them up, and that's where the students studied, and that's where the students lived. And so this is what resulted. Famous Jasper Cropsey a painting commissioned by Michigan's first president, Henry Philip Tappan. And so there are those two buildings, and you see that where the diag is now was still a place to graze livestock. Over here we have the medical building, and then this building here was one of 4 professors' houses. This is another, which I think the experts could tell me is this is not quite placed in scale. It should be farther this way. And then there were 2 more professors' homes. This became the president's house and is the only building from that period still standing. So you see, pretty bare, pretty plain. That was what they could afford to build. And then when this young fellow, Andrew Dixon White, was hired as a professor of history and came in the late 50s, I think, early 50s, a historian, went on to become a truly great American historian. When he got here and saw that landscape, he came from Yale, where there were magnificent elms filling the campus. His nostalgia for Yale caused him to say, couldn't somebody plant trees on this farm? And so he took it upon himself to do that because, of course, the president and essentially the administrative officer said, no, there's no money to plant trees on the campus. So he sort of raised some money and found seedlings and began to plant. Some of you know this story. The students had, this is the then professor's house, that became the president's house. So we're looking southeast across the diag. And these elms, with the help of students, Professor White planted all along the original crosswalks of the diag and then up and down State Street also. And this was the foundation of the tree-lined campus that we know. And White went on to become the founding president of Cornell. He left the university during the Civil War to become a state senator in his home state of New York. And as I say, became president of Cornell, had a great career there, was an ambassador. And then in 1911, he was retired, was rummaging around in his papers in Ithaca, and he finds plans for those original plantings. And he says, by God, I'm going to go back and take a look at those trees. He had seen them already. He had maintained a good relationship with the University of Michigan, but he thought, I'm going to go back one more time. And so a student finds this old man sort of moving around the diag, going from tree to tree, looking down at some papers and then looking at the tree. And he said, sir, what are you doing? And he explained his mission. And he said, I had among my papers a plot of the ground, the location of each tree, and the name of the student who planted it. And many of these students who had helped him in 1863 had gone off to the battlefields of the Civil War. And White said, there are more trees alive than boys. That's where the diag as we know it came from the initiative of a single professor getting some help from students and folks in town. Now, it's interesting to look at I did this a little while ago. I'm no architectural historian. I wouldn't have been able to name the styles of these buildings, but when you go through the styles, when you find out the architecture of the early buildings, the miscellaneousness of them is amazing. So here's the medical building, built in 1850, Greek Revival. Just to go through these quick. The law building, 1863, added on to, became Haven Hall. Italianate. The University Hall became the centerpiece of the university. Second Empire. Pavilion Hospital, 1876, Carpenter Gothic. They don't make them like that anymore. They built the homeopathic hospital right next to it in the same style, so there were two buildings that looked like that. Then the General Library, an impressive building, Romanesque Revival. Now that's right where the Hatcher Library is now, just fronting on the center of the diag with this magnificent half-circular reading room. Then, so it made, this eclectic place. And if you just look around, this is 1907, a painter named Richard Rummel was asked to paint this. Now you'd think that this is South University, State Street, here. You'd think that he was at the top of the Union, right, looking down. That's obviously how he got this vantage point. No, there was no Michigan Union yet. So in 1907, he imagines this landscape, and just look at the white brick, the red brick, the different kinds of towers. It's just a cornucopia of all kinds of different buildings. And that is the place, as Andrew said, that students of that era fell in love with. Not because it was a great architectural masterpiece, because it was familiar, because this is where they came of age. Now there's a turn with the coming of the Michigan Union and the Michigan League to a style that's now known as collegiate Gothic. And this was the work of two brothers, the Pond brothers, Irving and Allen, or the experts, Allen, Pond. And interestingly enough, they grew up in a house that was right here. and went on to become prominent architects in Chicago and came back to design the Union. This style was becoming more popular around the country. They designed the Michigan League in the same collegiate Gothic style. And I'm just going to race forward a little bit here, but Albert Kahn of Detroit became sort of the preeminent architect of the 20th century campus, designing buildings that looked like the front of the graduate library, utilitarian, efficient, and a famous quote of Kahn's is that architecture is, quote, 90% business, 10% art. That's how he got a lot of contracts. But he was a fine architect. But as you know, if you think about all the buildings built by Albert Kahn, say natural sciences, what are the other, Hill Auditorium, characteristic of Kahn's sort of handsome, severe style. He designed the Clements Library and what else am I thinking of that is a more divergent style? Anyway, but this is sort of the Kahn look. Somebody, what else?
Angel Red.
Angel. Yeah, in fact, after a couple of these buildings were built, some of the alums said, Jesus, Kahn's buildings look like factories. You know, that's not the way the campus should look. So he came back with the design for Angel Hall, which looks a lot like the Lincoln Memorial, which was designed by a friend of his. So that was some of his. But if you notice, I mean, you go inside Angel Hall, there's nothing decorative about that building. It's a very practical, functional building, not fancy in the interior. But more about this collegiate Gothic, just to follow up quick. The regents, you know, getting nostalgic in the 21st century, asked that new buildings be built in this style. So we have Whale Hall, the home of the Ford School, looks like the Union. North Quad looks like the Union. Royster Harper Hall looks like the Union. That has become now, that old Pond Brothers style has become sort of the reigning style at the university. Obviously, there's still tremendous eclecticism. All right, so that's my take on sort of how the campus comes together as a great hodgepodge architecturally. But I didn't want this just to be a bunch of pictures of buildings. I wanted to make this point about how, from the beginning, the students have shaped the campus in profound ways. And an interplay between the students going up against the university to shape the kind of lives that they wanted to have, and the university pushing back has really been the source of how the campus has evolved in many ways. This was one of the first students to attend the university in the 1840s. A guy named George Prey lived in that bleak, bare Mason Hall. And I always love this quote: "The student's life, especially in the winter, is a life in a circle. He eats and studies and recites and studies and eats." There wasn't anything else to do. Well, you went to chapel first thing in the morning, and then you'd probably go to church on Sundays. The students, especially as their numbers grew, 18, 19, 20, 20-year-old boys, they're not going to just stick with this all the time, right? And so, oh, that's the wrong thing. Some of you have read university history, know the name Wilfred Shaw, who was the great director of the Alumni Association for many years and a great historian of the university. He was also an artist. And this is a rendering that he gave of a shack that nobody really ever saw except the students who used it. And it was in a place called the Black Forest. Anybody know what the Black Forest was? It's across the street, the Arboretum. The students called that the Black Forest, and there was nothing there except for magnificent woods. And so a group of young men, this is in the 1850s, I think I've got that right, decided that they were going to create a fraternity. This was absolutely against the faculty's rules. and they could get kicked out of school for joining a fraternity, forming a fraternity. But they did, and they built this cabin out in the woods. Wilfred Shaw thought it might have looked like this, so he drew this picture. And that created the first great fracas between students and faculty, because the faculty found out about it, opposed it, tried to expel the students who were involved, and then they realized that pretty much all of the students had joined fraternities. And so some did get suspended, some were then reinstated. The boys got a lot of help from their parents, who thought that they had a right to form these associations if they wanted to. And so the fraternities stuck around. And it was really the first great moment when the students said, the university is what we say it is, to some extent. The faculty kept a very tight rein on the earliest students. This was them pushing back against that. And so things began to change. Now, many of you recognize this building. This is the original clubhouse, really, of Delta Kappa Epsilon, the Deeks. Still right over there on William Street. It's got a big stone fence in front of it now. Wonderfully, it has been preserved. And I think Deke took it over again, didn't they? I think that it was for sale. But I think the National Fraternity still has it. It's gone back and forth, it's changed hands sometimes. Anyway, this was one of the very first fraternities, and it was designed by a prominent architect, Chicago architect, who was on U of M's, I think it was U of M's first architecture professor, named William LeBaron Jenney. He designed this building for the Deeks, and that set in motion the whole archipelago of fraternities and then sororities that are very much characteristic of the blocks around the campus today. They form much of the fabric of campus life. That was because students wanted it that way. So another great characteristic of student life in the 19th century was violence. Some of it organized, some of it semi-organized, some of it purely improvisational. So this is a cartoon. What's Palladium, you guys? Palladium was the fraternity yearbook, I think, wasn't it? And had cartoons and graphic elements and stories. So you see this from the 80s, and the participants in whatever is going on here are the medics and the laws and something called the pharmacs. And I guess this means that this is the very, very earliest years of coeducation, so a woman is included in this photo. Notice how minuscule she is. So what this represents is an annual melee, not just, it wasn't a single event, it was unfolding events over time that went by the term of the rush. The rush might mean simple fights between freshmen and sophomores that broke out spontaneously, but in many cases it was organized sort of brutal clashes of students, and I mean hundreds of students at a time. And in some iterations, the aim was to throw your opponents over the fence on either side of the campus. That was sort of the goal. But this is very misleading, because we're not talking about just a few people involved. Like I say, it's dozens and scores and hundreds at a time, as you'll see. One of the great figures who recorded her life at the university in the 1870s, when she was among the first women students, named Mary Downing Sheldon, went on to a distinguished career. She writes, she was from Oneonta, New York. She writes home a letter to her best friend, and she says, "I must tell you about the rush. I never saw one until this semester. The sophs took off coats and vests and stood waiting. The fresh came out of their recitation room door and found their way blockaded. One after another tried to force his way. One after another was seized by foot, head, or any convenient part, his hair pulled by anybody who could reach it, his limbs pulled in as many different directions as there were softs around, and he was finally thrown down heels over head in the sand to bite the dust. Since seeing that, I have a much more vivid idea of the horror of a mob and the fierce cruelty of mankind. But you know, it sounds overwrought, right? But this is what it could look like. With all of these guys straining against each other to push each other from one side of the campus or a field to the other. This is a more organized event that took place, I think, in the 1900s, and probably at Ferry Field. You can see a big crowd of people that turn out to watch this event. And here, this young buck is just throwing off his shirt because he's ready to really show him who's boss. Here's another one. You might remember a fad called Earthball for a while. I think this was in the 70s. This was an early version of Earthball. There were attempts over time by the administration and the faculty to somehow prevent or control or at least channel this constant mayhem between both the classes or the schools. It became more of a freshman versus sophomore thing by the early 20th century. And so this big pushball event was one of the ways that they tried to do it. Another way was to organize pole rushes. So they'd mount these really tall poles, and they would grease them, and guys would try to lift one fellow up to the top while all the members of the other class are trying to pull them down. As you can imagine, a lot of people got hurt, like badly hurt. It was dangerous. And then I show you this because, why do you think I might show you the stadium? This is actually on the day of the famous Michigan-Ohio State game in 1969. Because the most important, or most lasting anyway, the most lasting way that faculty, college administrators, not just at Michigan, but around the country, tried to channel the violence of the rush was to foster the game of football. So why is that word so familiar to us? Obviously, rush is an essential part of American football, and it lives on in the terminology of fraternities and sororities too, the rush. So there's no question that although obviously football was an invention that drew from many strands, the rush was certainly one of them. And the pushing from one side to the other, the attempt to get a goal, to push others toward a goal, to push back, finds its way into football. Another aspect of student life that evaporated in the 20th century was the world of the boarding houses. Now, early on, President Tobin, the 1850s, said, we are not going to house the students. Students can be housed after those first effort to house just those very few students who started in the 1840s in Mason and South Hall. After that, Tobin coming in the early 50s said, we're going to allow the students to live in local homes. Well, those local homes, as the student body grew by the thousands, became a sort of sub-economy in Ann Arbor. Many, many of the homes that we still see around the central campus were places where students lived and boarded. This was one of the best known, started by a guy who was a key member of the early varsity football team named Prettyman. This was a famous boarding house on North University. And you can see this is post 1935 because you can see the Burton Bell Tower over at the left, but I think the house dates to around the turn of the 20th century and was torn down 1940-ish, I think. But this was the training table for the football team. Michigama, the Senior Honor Society, met at Prettyman's boarding house before it went up into the Tower of the Union. And as I say, these houses dotted the town, And this was a place where students lived independently. When they were outside of class, they were not, their lives outside the classroom were not regulated by the university. And this was true of women as well as men. The women of the first 30 years, 1870s through the turn of the century, lived often in the same boarding houses rooming houses that men did. And they knew each other, they dined together. Women of that era, once the women who were the first ones to be placed into the new residence halls, once they were, these older alums said, they're taking away the fundamental rights that we enjoyed when we were students in the 1870s, 1880s. We knew men, they knew us, we came to know and respect each other. In the wake of the boarding house era, the genders were segregated and separated and regulated, especially the women. The students devised events, rituals, festivities of their own. One of the best known was called Cap Night. Now, this took place, anybody guess where that is? Where is there a big hill like that? Right, it's really close by to where we're seated. Well, again, it's right across the street, and it's under a gigantic parking structure, right over here by Mott Hospital. There was a big natural bowl there. Now you see, these guys in front are all wearing caps. Those are all freshmen. And so they would be forced by the sophomores all year long, the freshman year, to keep that cap on at all times when they were outdoors, or else they would be severely punished and disciplined. But on Cap Night, which was in the spring near the end of the school year, all the freshmen joined all the other students, and I mean all the students, not all obviously, but a great many students would turn out for this big ritual. There would be speeches by prominent upperclassmen. There would be songs, college songs, great kind of festival of unity. And at the end, the freshmen would toss their caps off their head, and they would move on into the sophomore year. Cap Night went on for quite a while, I think into the 30s. World War II, as with other things on campus, brought it to an end. I believe that's right. You guys know Cap Night go until the 30s? Think so, Brian? Now, Cap Night was held in that bowl was called Sleepy Hollow. There was another Sleepy Hollow, also really close to where we are. We're up at the top of that hill, and this Sleepy Hollow is down the slope that goes down to Palmer Field here. And so these are students taking part in interpretive dance. You don't see that much these days outdoors. So there were two Sleepy Hollows. And you see, I don't know what this guy's doing. Who authorized him to take photographs? Or whether he was just figured he would catch some, for his private collection. Professor Hussey, who was the director of the observatory upstairs, an astronomer, there was a move to, what was it? It's before the building of what we now know as Washington Avenue here. There was to be a thoroughfare going right next to Sleepy Hollow. He was against it because he said that the passing motorists would interfere with the privacy of the women who would do their gymnastic exercises and dancing out here because they were clothed like this. You wouldn't want people to be passing by. Anyway, something that's been lost on this was instituted by the university. There was a great movement in favor of athletics and recreation for both men and women. And so it encompassed pretty much everybody took physical education. both indoors and outdoors. The women were not allowed so much to go in for team sports because that would be damaging to their physique, as we know. And so the men did that, but the women were more involved with calisthenics, swimming. There was some shooting and archery for women. Anyway, so this is another aspect of campus life that has gone by the board. Before Ann Arbor grew so much, students liked to take long hikes, especially on the weekends. And one of their favorite places to do that was along a stretch of path and road that was called the Boulevard. We're standing at the top of the Boulevard. Oh, wait a minute, here's a colorized view of it. So if you know where Cedar Bend Drive is, if you're standing at, say, at the hospital or, kind of on Glen Street and you're looking out to the northeast, up the ridge that runs along the north side of that part of Ann Arbor, that's where the boulevard wound up. But it trailed all the way down through that Cedar Bend, what's now the Cedar Bend Natural Area. This is the Huron Island, what's now called Island Park. Over here was called Picnic Island. And then, I don't know exactly how to follow this, but it went all the way up through past the, see if I use my pointer here, past the Catherine Street Hospitals, the old University Hospital. This is made sometime around 1900. And then over here, and then it would go up the slope and into what is now the Arboretum, winding up all the way at Getty's. So you could walk from Getty's down through what's now the Arb, all the way over to here. And that was called the Boulevard. And so hundreds of students and townspeople would on a nice day, would be counted going up and down this slope here. Now, obviously, Ann Arbor has beautiful parks still, but that sort of ritualization of a particular walk, of a particular hike, I think has vanished. You may not recognize the Michigan Union. So many of you know, but some of you probably don't, that the Michigan Union first referred not to a building, but to an organization. And this too was the creation of students. A student named Edward Bob Parker had the idea in 1904 while in his cups over at one of the saloons with his friends that there was too much, still too much animosity between fraternities and independents, between the members of the classes, between the members of the various colleges and schools. There ought to be some unifying organization on campus for men. And so the Michigan Union was formed, and it became an enormously successful organization that was sort of the clearinghouse, the supervising body for the vastly proliferating student organizations, lesser student organizations, smaller ones. And its first headquarters was this place, which was the home of Thomas McIntyre Cooley, who was the dean of the law school, and also for a while, Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court, very prominent jurist and legal scholar. This was his great stone house, also next to the ponds, right on the site of what is now the Michigan Union. Now, I showed the picture of the Union earlier. Just so you know how elaborate a sort of structure, organizational structure the Union was, and it went on until the 1970s. In the 1920s, shortly after the building that we call the Michigan Union opened, the Michigan Union had a board of directors, a board of governors, they're all students, a president, a general secretary, a recording secretary, and these vice presidents presiding over the House Committee, the Appointments Committee, the Entertainment Committee, which had 6 subcommittees, the Dance Committee. There were committees for the freshman mentor system. the Michigan Opera and the membership campaign, for publicity, for fall reception, for art, for billiards, for bowling, and the library. The Board of Governors had its own membership committee, and there were provisions for select general committees and select special committees in case of special need. So this is scores and scores of students actively involved in running this large umbrella organization and the many subsidiary organizations that were part of it. So just to think about a few of the things that I've mentioned here in what I would call the campus the students created. We now have the Office of Greek Life, the university's Office of Greek Life, which supervises those rebellious fraternities, which started out at war with the faculty. We have residence life, because the dormitories have utterly superseded the boarding houses. We have intercollegiate and intramural athletics, which have taken over for the Sandlot Games that students devised, and now the unions, that is the Michigan Union and the Michigan League, once independent student organizations, are called literally university unions. And all of those organizations, all of the student organizations, have been subsumed under the Vice President for Student Life. The university has reabsorbed all of those energies of those undergraduates over many generations. So I wonder if graduates today think of the campus think of the campus as a campus that students have made, or is it a campus simply that they have visited that is provided to them by the university? I think something has been lost along the way. Okay, I'd be happy to take any questions you may have. Yeah, Andrew, you want to start us off?
I'm going to start off because I am the host and I have that absolute power to ask what I want
That's
to
your
watch.
power.
So this was really interesting, and one of the themes that really came up repeatedly was sort of how the students, well, obviously how the students made the campus, but also the relationship between the campus and Ann Arbor more broadly. Are there any ways that the students made the town, so to speak?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can't really, you can't tell the history of Ann Arbor without not just the university, but the students. So, I mean, I guess the thing that comes to mind first is drinking, because that's what students have done in large numbers and very vigorously over many decades. Now, so the pattern of students wanting to drink beer, you know, starts in the mid 1900s or mid 1800s, and fuels the growth of taverns downtown mostly, because I'm not sure of the timing and the laws on the local ordinances on this, but my understanding is that no liquor could be sold east of Division Street. Now, that is not why Division Street is called Division Street, which I used to think has to do with the division of property, but that I believe I'm right that was the case. That changed in the 60s, and then the bars spread to the east of town, so that now State Street, South University, cater to student drinkers. And those, you know, the battle over where the saloons were going to be, how late they could stay open, that has characterized the town over time. So let's see, I mean, housing patterns. It once was that professors, many professors, lived close to campus. This is diverging from your question a little bit, Andrew, but it is an interesting phenomenon, I think. Professors lived close in. Many of the streets south of South University were filled with faculty homes. If you look at a faculty directory of 1910, 1920, and you go up and down those those departments and the listings. So many professors lived in the streets just north of what we think of as Burns Park and then going on down into Burns Park. The Old West Side was more of a working class neighborhood, very much a German American neighborhood. Some students lived there. But what that meant was that relations between faculty and students in the 19th century were much closer than they became. And professors did have students over for dinner, got to know them. Students got to know the wives of male professors. And that is not the way things are today. Faculty live farther out, the city is much larger, who knows where faculty live. And faculty are more transitory than they used to be. If you got a job at the University of Michigan as a faculty member, you stayed here. This was a career-capping job. Many faculty come for a while and then they move on. They are more loyal to their discipline than they are to the University of Michigan. So a geographer would say, what are the social relationships that we can gather from housing patterns in this city? That's, I think, a pretty profound change. Now, virtually every block close into campus, if it is not absolutely dominated by a gigantic soaring apartment building for students, it is still occupied by houses that students rent in their upper class years. Those are a couple things that come to mind, Andrew.
Okay. And the other question I had, and this is probably too broad a question, but I'm kind of curious. You've pointed to specific things about why the university, like the sort of push towards the development of intra-athletics, such as college. Yeah. Out of the Violence Academy. But what would you say some of the impetus for things like boarding room, or sort of the ending of the boarding houses, the absorption of the Michigan unions? I mean, there's probably a whole variety of topics, but I'm curious.
You mean, why did the university undertake those things?
Yeah, but they use a phrase like reabsorb them. Do you?
Well, if I just talk like this, can you all hear me pretty well?
No, we need that for the live stream online, unfortunately.
Hang on. Still on? Still okay? I'll just carry this, or I'll put it in my pocket. Well, I think this is a complicated, the various things going on over decades, and so it's a complicated story. In terms of athletics, I think that, and I'm not an expert on the history of sort of student sports, student athletics, intramural sports. People have written about this. Fielding Yost and others were great advocates of, what Theodore Roosevelt called the strenuous life. This was a period when people were nervous about the closing of the frontier, about the movement from farm to city. Youth, it was felt, were soft. Youth should be, they should receive physical training. They should receive athletic training. And so there was a great vogue for intramural sports, and Michigan was one of the leaders of those, starting around 1905, 1910, 1915. That's when the intramural building, still very much in use, was built. Yost was very much in favor of that, advocated for that, sports for all children and youth. So that's one of the things that's going on there, the organization of sports. Then what else did you ask about? The residence halls.
Yeah, the residence.
That's a topic that I've been especially curious about for a long time, and have tried to find out more about why the university came under increasing pressure to house women students. It happened gradually, but I think as their numbers approached 10, 20, 30% of the student body by around the turn of the 20th century, it was felt that young women should not be unsupervised in these boarding houses, that this was a danger to their character, and the university had an obligation to provide housing for them and supervision. And that was when the Office of the Dean of Women came into being. The first were also close to a building named for two of them. Eliza Mosher, who was more of a, would be more, feminists of today would be more comfortable with Dean Mosher. But then Myra Jordan was very much in favor of cracking down on these dangers to women. And so it was really she who brought about, first, speaking of the boarding houses, the institution of what were called the League houses. Many of the boarding houses for women came under the supervision of the Michigan League and then of the Dean of Women, who would approve these boarding houses as being, so this was mostly, I think, to reassure parents. Well, this is approved by the university. The owner, the house mothers in the League houses, you can count on them to keep an eye on these girls. So there are still, you know that there's a house kitty corner from the Ann Arbor District Library, a beautiful brick house on William Street there. My wife and I happen to have known a lady who died not long ago, past the age of 100, who grew up in that house in the 1930s. That was a League house. Her mother ran a League house, and she lived there with her siblings. But there were many League houses. And so, you know, that led in time to pressure for large dormitories, because the League houses could only house so many. The very first women's dormitories, Helen Newberry, Martha Cook, and Betsy Barber, were small and could only house only that many more. And so in the 20s, pressure came about to build a big dormitory for women, and that became Mosher Jordan. There's a great battle. This is called the Landladies' War. Women who owned and depended on boarding house income fought vigorously against the university building Mosher Jordan Hall. That was an organized lobby in town, and they were determined and not easy to overcome, but eventually they were. The men's dormitories came some years later, not until, what is the first men's dorm? West Quad, built onto the back of the Union, and that's late 30s, I think. And then comes East Quad, and what's the other big men's dorm I'm thinking of?
South Quad?
South Quad wasn't until the 50s. East Quad, West Quad. Anyway, those are the main men's dorms. And they came around a little later. Now, why the pressure for the men's dorms? I think that is a question that I can't answer. Why did the university not say, it's okay, you know, the men can take care of themselves, why can they not continue to live in the boarding houses? So that's a question leading to yet another story.
Well, I'm just going to ask one more question,
Okay.
and then I'll open it up to the audience. My question is, so a lot of these sites and sort of the evolution of campus you've talked about is late 19th, early 20th century. You were a student here at U of M. Are there any particular sites from your time as a student that you think are sort of reflective of these trends you were talking about from earlier eras?
Physical sites.
Physical sites or, emotional sites, I guess, maybe even?
Yeah. Well, I spent my 4 years at Michigan inside the Michigan Daily. So that's like the only site that I identify with strongly. I do identify strongly with the newsroom of the Daily and other parts of that building, the Student Publications building, which has been beautifully restored on Maynard Street. So I think that by the 1970s, when I was an undergraduate, these place-based traditions around the campus, I think it faded. And so there is, of course, one gigantic exception to that, Michigan football. So the trek down to the stadium on Saturday mornings and back after the games, I think that remains the sole unifying spirit. That is what students still care about as students en masse. I'm not a football fan myself, and I've always found the mania for Michigan football a little crazy, but that qualifies me. Like if I were, I'd be like a dissident in the Soviet Union saying, I think we ought to have democracy and freedom, and they say, you're going to the fucking loony bin. You can't say stuff like that. So that's about my position on Michigan football. But clearly, I mean, even more now, I mean, I don't know. My younger daughter's sitting in the back row over there. I don't think she's been to a Michigan football game. She went to Michigan. Is that not true or true? Two Michigan games. Now see, I think that's indicative. Okay, she went to Ann Arbor Pioneer. She grew up with Michigan football surrounding her. For her and some of her friends, it just wasn't that big a deal. But wouldn't you say, still exceptional, right?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't go to one when I was at school, let's be clear.
There you go. Yeah. So there's a certain intelligent, group of Michigan undergraduates that understand there are other things than football. So thank you for doing me proud, Claire.
Okay. With that, I think we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Please raise your hand. I'll call on you, but please wait till one of our docents brings you a microphone so that our online audience can hear your question as well, please.
Docents. Cool. This gent. Two gents.
So I'm not sure of the timeline.
Excuse me, can you hold it a little?
Sorry, I'm not exactly sure of the timeline, but you mentioned the cap night. I didn't know if that was inspired by one way or the other as far as throwing the graduation cap and gowns, or was it?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a good question. I never wondered about that. But it certainly makes sense, doesn't it? The tossing of the cap in the air. I don't know. How far back does tossing the cap in the air at graduation go? It's an interesting, it seems like the same rite of passage. I just don't know.
Right. What around when was that cap night?
I can't tell you when it started, but I think it was in full steam 1900, 1910, 1920, which in some ways is not in some ways, in most ways, is sort of the golden age of student activism in terms of school spirit, these kinds of rituals, activities that sort of celebrate being students. Now, as I say, much of it was semi-violent, but it was still sort of in this world that the students made. That really runs into the Great Depression and then stops dead. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just make a simple point?
Please wait for a
Yeah,
microphone.
wait for a mic, John.
Okay.
Can you bring a microphone? Hang on. Jonathan Marwell, who is the author of the definitive history of the city of Ann Arbor, A History of Ann Arbor.
I think it's quite possible that throwing up of the caps was a copycat of the Army and Naval academies. That what they had gone through for so long, a much more intense discipline, and now they were free. Now they could throw their caps in the air and screw anybody else who was there.
The cadets do that at West Point, right? They hurl their caps in the air. Yeah. Good point.
Right there. Other questions online?
In the two wars, in World War I and World War II, did women take on, with men off in war, many men, I mean, there were some women went off to war in various support positions. Did women take on more leadership roles, within the university settings, within, the Senate or whatever was available?
Yeah, the answer is yes. Especially in World War II, which of course is a much longer duration for students to be gone. I don't know that I've looked at the officer roles for student organizations during World War I, but it's just that 1 year, 17, 18. But from 1942, after Pearl Harbor, through 1945, women became dominant in student organizations. So, the first managing editor of the Michigan Daily, of course, student activities declined to a significant extent. But yeah, there were women officers in many organizations that traditionally would have been taken by men, and then after the war, the men come back in. Yep.
What do you know about the zoo?
Oh yeah, Andrew advertised the zoo. I left it off. So there was a University of Michigan zoo, also close to where we are here, behind the Natural Sciences building, now the Ruthven Administration building. It was a real zoo. It was created, for some reason, the year 1930 is coming back to me. I'm not sure if that's right or not. And it lasted, I think, into the 60s. And so if you talk to people who grew up in Ann Arbor, really? You remember the zoo?
Oh, I do.
Well, tell us about it.
Well, there,
Please,
I remember there were...
Here, take the microphone.
Oh, all right. What I remember is that there were two unfortunate bears all
Yeah,
summer.
this was not a great zoo.
No, that just smelled so awful. As a child, you were just, they had a wolverine,
Yep.
and a fox, I think.
Uh-huh. Raccoons and,
Yes.
yeah.
But I remember the bears mostly.
Coyote, I think, maybe. Yeah, the bears. I mean, imagine what a thrill that would be to see a real bear. Yeah, I think that, there was a time when Fielding Yost brought a wolverine to the stadium, and the poor wolverine got housed at the zoo, this poor creature. But now, what era would that have been? Not to date you, but...
Probably late 40s, I was a child.
And so, all through that post-war period, that would be a place you'd go on field trips. You'd go to Angel School, you'd come to the zoo. It wasn't very big, and as I say, it wasn't very nice. And I think that the animals finally, somebody said, this is not a great idea anymore, and the animals got shipped up to some fly-by-night zoo near Grayling, which probably wasn't a great end. But it certainly is something that people who grew up in Ann Arbor in that time remember vividly, as you say, and with a lot of fondness, except for the smell. Then.
So we attended an event in 2017 that talked about the creation of Angel Hall as a bid by the city of Ann Arbor to become the capital. They were back in
1837.
1837. So I was having trouble with the pictures. Pardon me. So Mason Hall and South Hall predated Angel Hall?
Oh, yeah. Angel Hall was not built until the 1920s. So the dates are a little turned around. But you're absolutely right that when the state was founded in the 1830s, there were various prizes to be doled out to cities. The prize number one was the state capital. Ann Arbor land developers were hoping to get that, okay? And so that's why State Street is called State Street. That was an effort by those developers. All of this was we were a little east of the village of Ann Arbor, which is centered more around, Main Street and Huron. This was a little bit out in the boondocks. These were new plats over here, new roads and streets. So State Street was named State Street with the hope that that would be that the Diag would be the site of the state capitol. But the first great building on State Street was University Hall, 1872. That was one of the pictures that I showed. So you're right about the place and the effort to do that, but it wasn't Angel. That didn't come until later. Yeah. What else?
Thank you. Your talk's been great. Can you comment about the eclectic development of the museums on campus, Art, Kelsey, NatSci, and other collections?
I won't be able to say much that's very interesting, but I'll say the the first Board of Regents, this same Board of Regents that were making these decisions about where the diag would be placed, hiring the first professors, buying the first books, and I'll say a word about that. They also had a term in their sort of mission statement that the word is cabinet, which was a word for museums or museum collections. These were to be the stuff of faculty research. You had to have stuff to look at, to study. And so that's the foundation of the museums. Experts from the Bentley would probably be able to answer this question far better than I. I think the Museum of Art is the first big museum. Fran, you know a lot about the...
Sorry, Fran, can you wait for a microphone?
Oh, wait for a mic, Fran. Public goods, that became the term, right?
Well, that's
later.
Public goods is a late 20th century term.
Right.
But I think certainly the museum, the first art, I can't remember the date, but the idea of buying art dates back to almost to the founding.
To the beginning.
Along with libraries, which was, as you say, other collections. So the point is, though, that Taplin was very, very concerned that we have the materials of learning, and that those are the materials that would connect the faculty to the world, because we were isolated here, so isolated.
Right.
So they...
It was a big...
way back.
It does, and it was a very important part of how the university saw itself. As Fran says, this is Fran Bluen, the longtime director of the Bentley Library, professor of history and library science. The story I was going to tell about the library is one of my favorites. One of the original regents was named Dr. Zena Pitcher of Detroit, and Zena Pitcher Street is right behind us over here. And he was a very active guy, very bright guy. And he was interested in the formation of the library. And the most important thing that happened was that they hired a very prominent botanist named Asa Gray to go to Europe. He was appointed a faculty member, but they said, we're not ready to teach any courses yet, and we need a library. Would you mind going to Europe and buying a library for us? Which Gray did, with a lot of help from a New York publisher, George Palmer Putnam, one of the founders of a great publishing house. But along with Gray going and buying those books, Dr. Pitcher heard about a kind of an eccentric frontiersman named John James Audubon, who was assembling a magnificent multi-volume, gigantic folio book called The Birds of America. And so he arranged for the university to purchase a copy of that book. It was the first book in the university's collection, and it is now among the most valuable books in the world. And it is, you can go see it in a special room at the Hatcher Library, and every week a librarian goes in and turns a page, so you can see another wonderful Audubon bird. Those were, God, I used to know a lot about this. Those were engraved plates that were used to make those, and Audubon painted the birds from which the plates were made. He had help with the foliage surrounding and the landscape surrounding the birds. There's a great book about the creation of that book called Under a Wild Sky, about Audubon and the making of the birds of America. We've got one of them, and it was the first book in the collection. I think that's amazing. So, but that was part of that, as Fran Bluen said, that's part of the early realization that if we're going to have faculty and students here in this isolated place, we need materials for them to work with. Yeah.
I think one more question in person, then we'll see if the online audience has anything to say.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you could talk briefly about the origins of the civil rights movement on campus, from the divestment movements today for human rights to the 1960s. Do you see the history of campus organizing as something that comes about after World War II, or how far back in the university's history can you trace that history? You talk about the relationship of universities to fraternities. Could you talk about, a historical moment as far back as possible about the university's maybe adversarial or collaborative relationship in history with the earliest movements of civil rights going back to the Civil War?
Abolitionists didn't get very far in Ann Arbor. Some of them got sort of ridden out of town on a rail. There was great Union sentiment in Ann Arbor, but not great anti-slavery sentiment. The thing that comes to my mind first in this area, it's not so much a civil rights movement as a protest movement, social protest movement, is the anti-war movement of the 1930s. Michigan students were deeply involved in that movement. You may have heard of something called the Oxford Pledge, which began in England. That was a pledge by which students said that they would not bear arms against foreign adversaries. That spread to the U.S., and there was a sort of chapter of students pursuing that here. If you look shortly after the war at the Michigan Daily, you'll see time and time and time again, beginning in the 1950s, well before the 1960s, support for the early civil rights movement in the South. That builds and, of course, becomes very important in the early 1960s. Then gets, sort of caught up in the whole wave of protest movements focused on Vietnam in the mid to late 60s. The great Vietnam teach-ins of 1965 began at Michigan. So that's when things really start to pick up. I'm trying to think what else. Of course, then there was a powerful interest in New Wave feminism. The gay liberation movement had an important chapter in Ann Arbor, starting at least in the early 70s, probably back to the 60s. People may remember the Rainbow People's Party, a great social justice warriors, counterculture warriors in the late 60s and into the 70s. The Human Rights Party. So it's almost too big a question to answer, and I'm not the greatest expert at it, but certainly Ann Arbor has been a haven of social protest movements and support for civil rights movements from, as I say, certainly from the 1950s right on through today.
Well, let's see if the online audience has some questions for us. Give them a chance.
There's a pretty vigorous conversation in the comments in the online audience.
They really like me, huh?
No, they have some good questions. No, this is all positive. The first question that comes to mind that came to mind of our audience online was, you got to the creation of the Michigan League as the organization. What about the Michigan League building?
Yeah, the League was created before the Michigan Union organization. Women organized in the 1890s to create the League. It's an interesting development and sort of builds over time, creates many smaller subsidiary women's organizations. And then after the Union was built, there was a move to create, a comparable building for women to house the offices of the League. So the League opens in 1929, I believe. Some building programs were stalled by the Depression, but the League got in under the wire. And that, too, was a place for women's organizations. Now, of course, there are a great many social events that were held both at the Union and at the League. There are, those spectacular ballrooms in both buildings, but also places for large public addresses. Large, not big enough for Hill, but big enough to draw a big crowd. And so those ballrooms held many important speeches, but also dances, banquets. These were great gathering centers for student organizations. The League just as much as the Union. The league is not quite as big as the union, but really has meeting places for lots of groups and lots of activities. And they're still used that way. But it's more sort of offerings from the university rather than student-driven activities. What else?
Thank you. There was a question about your thoughts on Waterman Gym, Ferry Field, Drake's Sandwich Shop, which is gone. And one of our online viewers asked, does Michigan do enough to preserve its architectural history? Which, of course, is your thoughts on the matter.
The university has just been this gigantic bulldozer, right? This maw that creates things and then tears them down. I thought about making that point with two photographs, one of the renderings for the Fleming administration building, which at the time was, ultra modern, this spiffy design by the modernist architect Alden Dow of Midland. So it was this, wow, what a statement, what a great statement of the new and the modern. And then I would have the next photo showing half of it gone, which is about 4 years ago already now, and that field is open. So, I'm not the guy in charge of the university's physical plant. If I were, I'm sure like those folks, I would have to think about what is functional, what is economical. We're serving today's students, not the alumni, not students of 100 years ago. And yeah, we loved Waterman Gym, but does Waterman Gym make sense for today's students? I don't know if Andrew mentioned, but I've taught for 20 years at Miami University and just retired. And I had to move out of, and that's a campus that very much values its architectural sort of pristine alikeness. All the buildings are supposed to look alike. I was in a building that didn't look like any of the other buildings. So they're going to tear that down, and it's going to be torn down in about 3 weeks. But everyone moving out, including me, was told to make sure to turn in their office key. So that's the university bureaucracy at work there as well as here. I was also going to show a photograph that I just took the other day of that looming monstrosity at the corner of Packard and State, the new apartment building. And I was next to the intramural building, and I sort of had the IM building being dwarfed by this looming thing. Places change. It's capitalism. I can't do anything about it. But then there are exceptions. One of them is upstairs. The observatory was saved. That was a great move. And I bet you don't give credit to the president who deserves it, James Duderstadt, who doesn't get much credit for things around here anymore. That's one of many things he did. Cared about the history of the university. I like the preservation of the old Carnegie Library facade on the Huron side of North Quad. That is a gesture to the past, at least. And I like what I pointed out about the Irving and Allen Pond collegiate Gothic style being nodded to with North Quad and Whale Hall and now the new Royster Harper dormitory complex, as massive as it is. There's the university continues to grow enormously. 10,000 students in the last 10 years. I haven't seen somebody explain why. But as long as that continues, these buildings are going to go up and then they're going to come down. I'm a preservationist, but it's putting your finger in the dike.
If I could do maybe one more question from the online audience. Did students engage with what became North Campus before it became North Campus?
I don't think so. Those were farms. And so you couldn't, maybe people walked out there between farms, but that was farmland that was bought by the university. Interesting thing, a little thing about North Campus and its growth. And this pertains to the last question too. President Angel, arguably the great president in the university's history, president for 40 years and some, really the author of the university that we know today, of its prestige in the nation and in the world. But he said, and he certainly was responsible for a lot of growth in the student body and in the faculty, but he said, what are we going to do? We can't take over central Ann Arbor. We will alienate the city. It was when the city was a lot smaller in 1900 than it is now. And so there was sort of this feeling of the campus bursting at its seams for many years. And then finally, in the 1940s, I think Alexander Ruthven was the first president who said, we really must do something about this, and began to lay plans for a big expansion. The first place they looked, interestingly, was south of campus, because all that State Street property that now has been filled in, some of it by university athletic properties, the golf course, a lot of that was still open. So there was some thought, that's where we'll expand. But I think the reason they didn't is because that land was already too expensive. With the building of Stadium Boulevard, and then 94 coming through, that was seen to be more valuable land. And so they looked at what's called Lower Town, just on the other side of the river. That was probably cheaper, but I think that was thought of as too low. It's too vulnerable to flooding. And so then this discovery of North Campus was made with the understanding we're going to have buses to carry students and other people back and forth. And so, you know, that accommodation was made, seemed to be relatively successful. And so we had this odd bifurcated place that we live in here with North Campus, bigger and more populous than it used to be. Okay, shall we wrap up?
I think maybe one more question if we have one. There you go. We have a volunteer.
Well, it's related to what you just said about North Campus. Do you know anything about this Concordia property? Is that just
no, I don't know anything.
North Campus?
I don't know anything except I had a good idea for it. They just approved the purchase, but they haven't said what they're going to do with it, have they? They should put the residential college there. The residential college was supposed to be a new place that would be built just on the other side of the Huron, on what we now think of as North Campus, but close in, near Fuller Field. And those plans were abandoned. Things went better in East Quad than people thought they would, and so East Quad became the permanent home of the residential college. I was in the residential college briefly and liked it, but decided to transfer back over to LSNA. So was my daughter Claire for a little while. And the thing is, imagine a true, like a reinvigoration of that college within a university concept, which really was great. It's a great idea. And there's no reason that more small colleges within giant megalopolis universities like Michigan couldn't thrive. The pilot program was another good example. That succeeded. But nobody has picked up the ball. To me, Concordia would be the perfect place with existing buildings to put a bunch of really smart students in the humanities and the arts, put them all in one place, and see what happens. So, you heard it here first.
Well, I think on that note.
Have you made a recommendation to that effect?
No, I haven't passed this along to the regents, but right after this tonight.
Well, I think on that note, we will bring this to an end so we can start drafting that.
Thank you very much.
For those of you in the audience here tonight, the original 1850s Observatory building, one of the oldest still here buildings on campus, will be open till about 8 o'clock. We have a really wonderful team of student docents who do tours, will show you the telescope. We may or may not be observing. It's still pretty bright out and kind of cloudy, but you can at least see the telescope. If you can't stick around, or if you're only joining us virtually, the observatory is open Thursday afternoons, Friday afternoons, and select Saturdays every month. Thank you all for joining us.
Take a look. That's a treat.
It's
right upstairs.
It is a really cool place. But thank you for joining us. Making Michigan will be back in the fall. Have a wonderful evening.